Nerdrotic.com.
Previously, we talked about a den of activists. Oh, there I go. I did it again. Den of Geek article that tried to equate the Lord of the Rings fandom with the Lord of the Rings of Power backlash to mass murderers. That's right. A couple of mass murderers who also happen to like Tolkien. Those guys, and you for comparing us to them. Now we have an article that, quite frankly, is more honest with what they really want. Spoilers, it's not about getting a good Tolkien adaptation. It's about using his story as a platform. A lot of practitioners of identity politics and activism have felt very free to write articles like this in the past because, quite frankly, they have been. They haven't gotten any clapback, and when there is, they can always just roll out the racism. Be forewarned, I don't give a fuck what any of them think of me. I don't give a fuck what any of them say about me. But I do care what they say about us. The problem is the giant corporations that have been pilfering our beloved stories and mythology do give a what they think, and they do have influence, and they have been allowed to roam free and poison fandom for too damn long. The things that used to bring us together but now divide us because of the introduction of identity politics and activism. And I know there's a lot of people out there, especially some content creators, who believe that we should just give up, walk away because they are in control. Why bother? We can't win this fight. Again, that's exactly what they're counting on. And thankfully, the Lord of the Rings fans are the ones who finally said enough. Well, the activists and the practitioners of identity politics have been busy little beavers, although I don't want to disrespect beavers because they actually build things, all while calling us gatekeepers. And in this case, guilty as charged.
Goddamn right.
This Week in Stupid brought to you by The Conversation. Lord of the Rings debunking the backlash against non-white actors in Amazon's new adaptation. J.R.R. Tolkien's much-loved fantasy, The Lord of the Rings, is a work of epic scale portraying races of imaginary beings in the medieval-esque setting of Middle-earth, culminating in a battle of good against evil. Peter Jackson's film adaptations in the early 2000s established the iconography and aesthetics that many fans grew up with and consider almost sacred. And I would argue, yes, a lot of people do consider Peter Jackson's trilogy sacred. I think it's the greatest trilogy ever made, but what I consider sacred is Tolkien's text, and that's what we're talking about here, not the Peter Jackson films, as great as they are. Now, Amazon's new adaptation of Tolkien's work is coming to our screens in September. The Lord of the Rings of Power, recent reports, and a newly released trailer have revealed more details about plot lines, ramping up the anticipation. What they would call plot lines, I would call a vandalization of Tolkien's sacred text. But it is the diverse casting, which includes non-white actors playing an elf and a female dwarf, which has caused an uproar in certain quarters of Tolkien fandom. Some fans argue that Tolkien never described elves, dwarves, or hobbits as anything but white, and claim that the casting is disrespectful to his books. But this argument is flawed in two ways. I am very interested to hear this. First, these are imaginary creatures. Well, if there are imaginary creatures and you're going to go to the "it really shouldn't matter" argument, then why does it matter to you? And believe me, they get to that argument, which are not always clearly described in the original books. Notice that they say they are not always clearly described, except for the times they are pretty clearly described. Some things are not, and there's a lot of assumptions being made, assumptions that have only been made very, very recently. Tolkien was more interested in the metaphysical than the biological questions. Most certainly later in his life, yes, but when he was writing the book, again, that's an assumption. Incidentally, it took two authors to construct this article. Dimitri Fimi, senior lecturer in fantasy and children's literature, co-director, Center of Fantasy and the Fantastic, University of Glasgow, and our good friend Mariana Rios Carlos Maldonado, PhD candidate for comparative literature, University of Glasgow. By the way, this article was funded by the University of Glasgow. Still, there is some evidence of dark-skinned elves, which I refute, and hobbits in drafts of the Silmarillion. The key word there is drafts, and the prologue of The Lord of the Rings. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller, shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair. Again, we're all going on assumption here because I don't know for sure, but I'm just gonna guess. When Tolkien said browner of skin, he probably meant olive skin.
Hobbits are just rustic English people, made small in size because it reflects the small reach of their imagination, but it's not the small reach of their courage or latent power.
I think the hobbits are not only specifically English, but Tolkien would have said straight away that they're specifically West Midlanders, that they remind him of the society of his youth, and they come actually from Warwickshire, Worcestershire, but he really means a very close area. And in many ways they represent, as it were, traditional English feelings.
Now there's another part where he mentions fairer skin as it applies to the hobbits, and that would also mean it applied to the elves that the activist academics choose to ignore.
It's not debatable. The Eldar are pretty much all described as having fair skin. The darkest they ever seem to get is olive skin, so no darker than a Spaniard or a Greek. They would never even be Sicilian dark. It just doesn't happen anywhere in the text at all. Their hair colors and eye colors give it away. They're clearly Nordic, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon in their descriptions. If you're making a game based on the lore, which is what the fans would want, there would never be dark-skinned elves. It just wouldn't happen.
As my good friend Just Some Guy points out in his great video, which will be linked in the description, the elves were created before there was a sun. They were more comfortable in starlight. Second, if Tolkien had been specific that all elves, dwarves, and hobbits were white, and he was specific with elves by describing them as fair, but go ahead and continue to ignore that, it still wouldn't matter. There's the argument I was waiting for.
Nor are the histories and genealogies in the least necessary to the narrative, but they have given much infantile happiness to the Tolkien clubs and societies. Well, that's just name-calling, infantile happiness. But when somebody says the histories and genealogies are not in the least necessary to the narrative, now that's dead wrong. That's not only wrong, that's stupidly wrong. Actually, what they give to the narrative is something which Tolkien was very aware of, and which he often talked and wrote about, and which he valued very much, and that is depth. So you don't just have, as it were, a flat, garish, shiny surface. You have something which has depth behind it, and a feeling that this is a world where you can ask a question about it, and you'll get an answer. And if you ask a question about the question, or a question about the answer, then you'll get more answers, because it's all there already.
Adaptations are original cultural products that can imitate, question, rewrite, or interpret or reinterpret source material in various ways. Each adaptation is a new text, and each is an opportunity to update outdated and unacceptable tropes and find ways to represent and normalize non-white characters. Who's being the racist? These conversations are not new to academia. These conversations are most certainly new to fandom. You have to at least appreciate their honesty with their own racism, but the stupid doesn't end there. Reinventing Tolkien for the 21st century. Again, I appreciate your honesty. As adaptation theory scholar, more scholars here, Linda Hutchin has shown adaptations offer the pleasure of repetition with variation. The thing is, no one's ever seen a Second Age story. This isn't being repetitive unless you plan to completely repurpose The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which I suspect is going to happen because there's a bad reboot influence. Kind of like they did with The Force Awakens, just turning Luke Skywalker into a girl minus the personality and character arc. Proving once again that this is a direct response to our videos and a reach. But as disgruntled fans might reason, if Amazon must have a diverse cast in this drama, why not stick to having actors of color playing the characters who are dark-skinned in Tolkien's text? a very good question. There is multiple ways you could use the Easterlings, the Harad. You can do something with the Númenóreans or the race of man in general, kind of like they did a little bit in The Hobbit, but that would perpetuate and reinforce the racialized view of good and evil in Middle-earth.
That's disgusting. Disgusting.
I remind you once again, this article is co-authored by Tolkien self-labeled scholar Mariana Maldonado, who said this.
Thinking about the role of diversity, one of the few mentions that we have in the maps is, for example, the region of Harad or Umbar.
Yes.
Where will that narrative take us? And will these, let's say, peoples also be given a voice? Things that we hadn't seen before.
And if you're waiting for the orc argument, you don't have to wait any longer. Tolkien's portrayal of the orcs, legions of evil creatures, and the men who ally themselves with Sauron uses many stereotypes associated with Orientalism and the language of prejudice. Isn't that the language of prejudice? Often found in literature from the era of British imperialism. Tolkien was born and grew up in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, reproducing this white non-white divide along moral lines would endorse a very old-fashioned and harmful equation of physical characteristics with moral choices.
Stupid fat hobbit.
It's been a couple years now since I've been doing these videos, and I warned you this was coming, and now it's here. And you're hearing it from supposed Tolkien fans and scholars. As a popular element of 21st century culture, fantasy's issues with race, racism, and white privilege are subjects the genre has not yet fully addressed. Amazon's new series is a step in the right direction. Should really tell you everything you need to know. And as I've said in previous videos, I am so proud of the Tolkien fandom right now coming together and clapping back at this. From a Guardian article about a week ago, the history of fantasy is racialized. Lord of the Rings series sparks debate over race. And you want to know who sparked all of these debates that didn't used to be in fandom at all, when all makes, shapes, and sizes used to come together in joy to just share what they love? You, worshiper of identity politics, the activist, or the access media hack, or D, all of the above. And you want to know who this month's senior of masculinity goes after? YouTubers. YouTubers complaining about fan mistreatment have hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of subscribers. Inevitably, these fans are devoted to movies, TV shows, and comics from their childhoods, and many are constantly on the watch for a new version that might expand the role of women, add characters of color, or include characters who aren't straight. No, that's just Twitter. When they're riled up, they can coordinate broad campaigns of harassment and even threats of violence across social media and skew perception of public opinion. It's the sort of thing that often meets with approval of the broader right-wing media, which will sometimes fan the flames of a useful controversy. Talented social media trolls have gone on to jobs on cable television. Well, at least he said they're talented.
I don't write for The Guardian. I am a YouTuber, and I do not believe that your position is in any way more prestigious in a meaningful sense. You don't have a better opinion because you write your fucking trash on a fucking trash website.
That, of course, is Rags from EFAP, and I couldn't have said it better myself, so that's why I didn't. Bottom line, why do they want to destroy Lord of the Rings? Because it's their holy grail. It's a traditional story by a traditional guy that just so happens to be insanely popular, and they're running out of popular things to twist and mutate into their platforms of influence and then ultimately destroy. The mask has come off. These aren't fans of Tolkien. They despise him. That's why they need to reinterpret, reimagine, or make accessible. Where have I heard this before? Oh, I heard this with another brilliant property, or formerly brilliant property, from the UK, Doctor Who. I heard we need to hear new voices, new perspectives, and all you did was appeal to fewer people. So in a very strange way, with this incoming disaster, and believe me, it's going to get much worse once we hear the actual story, you have united the Lord of the Rings fandom. The downvotes on the trailers keep going up, and the spin will ramp up, and we will be here every single time. If you like what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, I thank you for listening this long. I will see you in the next video.
Nerdrotic.com. Please subscribe.